And welcome back to the Genesis Science Report. Joining us is Dr. James Johnson, Chief Academic Officer and Associate Professor of Apologetics at the Institute for Creation Research. Now, Dr. Johnson is also a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and has brought profound insights into the intersection of history, science, and faith. His article, Viking Bones Contradict Carbon-14 Assumptions, explores the flaws in carbon dating and its implications for understanding historical timelines. Dr. Johnson, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you, David. It's great.
Listen,
great to be here with you.
You know, and I love it when you're in studio, the stories that you tell and the way that you relate historical events back to not just biblical accuracy, but to divine providence is just astounding. But I appreciate you joining us here today because I'm looking over the article right now, and I just wanted you briefly to share how your background helps you identify errors when using science to understand the origins of life.
Well, anytime you're dealing with origins, you're talking about no longer observable events of the past, which means the uniformitarian assumption won't work. Much of what gets called science nowadays is empirical science, meaning somebody is observing something in the present. In fact, in theory, everybody can observe the same thing if they're in the right place at the right time. However, if you're talking about an event of the past that's no longer observable, and if it's unique, like the cause of something, whether it's what happened during Creation Week or the worldwide flood, or whether it's a traffic accident at the nearest intersection, those are events of the past and they're unique. So you can't make uniformitarian assumptions in order to figure out what happened. What you really need is a reliable eyewitness. And I've had years of practice as a litigator in federal and state courts since 1985. And then I've also served as a trial judge since 1990. And I've had an opportunity to use the rules of evidence in forensic contexts in order to determine what did happen in the past, and is there a reliable eyewitness to help determine what happened when you're making that inquiry.
Okay, so maybe you can break down a general discovery of findings. There were a number of skeletons discovered in England. Tell me what was found and then where the mystery came in with the dating.
Okay, a little more than 30 years ago, well, let's see, no, it's more than 30 years. Well, I better not do math in public. In the late 20th century, about 250 to 300 skeletons were found in a mass burial in the middle part of England. That's important. It's not on the coast, because when the Viking era began, the Vikings who were visiting England and doing snatch and run type attacks were busy along the coastlines. But within a century, many of them decided not to just grab stuff and then zoom away in their boats, but rather they intended to stay there over the winter. The winters in England a lot milder than in Scandinavia. So they had settlements in the interior part of England, and there was one in particular group called the Great Heathen Army. They were especially active in the 860s and 870s, and many of them, the historians believe, were buried in this mass burial in Repton, England, which is close to the center of England. But the biochemist who tested their bones for radiocarbon said, oh, whoever lived in these skeletons must have died 100 or 200 years earlier than that, based on how much carbon-14 is left in these skeletons. And of course, that's assuming that there is a good understanding of how much carbon-14 should be left in the skeletons, measured by time, and that involves the half-life of decay for radiocarbon-14.
Interesting. So how do these 300 skeletons discovered in England relate to what we know from empirical science?
Well, here is the trick. Those skeletons were buried about more than 1,000 years ago, 1,150 years ago. If the chemists are right, those skeletons represent people who died in 600 or 700 AD. If the historians are right, and for 30 years this was an argument in academic and in the research communities, the historians said no, these skeletons, and especially some of the coins that are found with them, which they're kind of hard to evade the relevance of, they're from the late 800s. Finally, right around the turn of the century, a researcher came up with the clue and to solve the mystery, and here it is. All right, fish. The Vikings were eating lots of fish, salmon and cod and herring and trout, and that makes a difference in how much carbon-14 you get in your body, which eventually gets into your skeletons, because fish and other seafood, they don't have the same amount of carbon-14 that gets into plant-based foods, such as nuts, such as fruits, such as root vegetables, such as, well, we don't eat grass. However, we eat sheep who eat grass. So if radiocarbon 14 through the atmosphere is through photosynthesis getting into the plants, whether that be trees or whether that be grasses or other vegetables or fruits, ultimately all that carbon 14 makes it into our food chain, either directly by what we eat, nuts and vegetables and grains, or whether if we're eating herbivores, such as foods from cattle or sheep. So the assumption for 50 years at least was that everybody was eating a plant-based diet, and therefore you could use a certain formula of radioactive decay in order to figure out how long ago somebody had died based on how much carbon-14 was left in their bones. Well, in the case of the Vikings, since so much of what they ate was fish and other foods from the sea, in fact, even when they were eating swine, a lot of times it was common in Viking communities to eat the part of the fish, eat the part of the fish they want to eat, and then take the part they don't want to eat and just toss that out onto the ground, and that's what the pigs would eat. So later, when the Vikings would eat the pigs, they were still eating a marine-based diet instead of a plant-based diet.
So in other words, every situation that they were encountering was literally changing the way that we would measure the carbon-14 and the way the assumptions that we would make.
Right. And one of the best ways I think of proving that was when they would dig up skeletons in Iceland, where they were able to find the skeletons with fragments of wool clothing. And of course, the wool came from sheep that only ate grass, vegetable matter, whereas the Viking skeletons that they disinterred basically were mostly eating a fish-based diet. Yeah. And so they could tell that these skeletons that had fragments of wool clothing, that the carbon-14 for the wool clothing that they're wearing was very different from the skeletons themselves. So they figure out, okay, we could probably figure out an adjustment that we can use based on the difference between these two readings, and then apply that in general to put a date on when these humans died and left their skeletons eventually to be their remains.
Wow. Okay, so is there a way to accurately prove the exact date that someone was born on, or is that a tricky thing to do?
Well, that goes back to forensic science, because when you think about it, when were you born? When was I born? Mm-hmm. For each one of us, that was a unique event of the no longer observable past. So this is basic forensic science, namely, you can't look at me, I can't look at you and tell what day you were born. Mm-hmm. So how do we even know what day belongs on our driver's licenses or our passports? Yeah. There needs to be a reliable witness who was there when I was born, when you were born, so that we can know exactly what day we were born. Empirical science cannot test me and tell you when I was born. Huh. However, I am confident I know the day I was born because there was a reliable eyewitness there when it happened, my mother. And she took the whole thing very seriously, as I'm sure your mother did too. And as a result, that date got written down and was treated as a very important date. and that's been repeated and repeated. We have that from reliable eyewitnesses, kind of like the Bible. The Bible is God's reliable eyewitness account of what happened back in the past, no longer observable, unique events of the past, like the events of Creation Week, like the worldwide flood, like the resurrection of Christ. Those are all unique events of the no longer observable past. And frankly, we won't know the truth of what happened then unless there is a reliable eyewitness who can tell us in language that we understand what happened. And of course, that's what the Bible is. It is God's report. He is the ultimate reliable eyewitness. And so what he gives us in the Bible, we can know for sure. And frankly, a whole lot of that we would never know otherwise. We could make guesses.
Yes. Incredible. Okay, so basically we have the ultimate eyewitness, the historical record that God himself inspired people to write down that has stood the test of time. In the last few seconds, how do the findings from these Viking skeletons relate to the biblical accounts we read in Genesis? What's our takeaway?
Well, our takeaway is do not underestimate the importance of a reliable eyewitness account of something that happened in the past that is a unique event, no longer observable today. Yeah. And if you're talking about the events that are reported in Scripture, that's the only way we will know the truth of what happened. People can speculate their day and night for weeks and months and years and never get it right. Yeah. But if we open the pages of Scripture, we get not only the report of a reliable eyewitness, but the perfect reliable eyewitness. He knows everything. He's always truthful. He has a perfect memory, and he's great at communicating.
By the one who knows it all. Thank you, Dr. Jim Johnson. Jim, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, David.
And that's it for today. I want to thank you for joining us on the Genesis Science Report. Until next week, I want you to keep looking up. I'm David Rives. Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God.